Welcome to the Royse City Church of Christ. Those who are visiting, we're glad you're with us this morning. We want to also remember in our prayers the upcoming mailing that's going to take place in the mid part of April, about April 15th. Here we have a sample of what will be mailed to about 6,600 homes or mailboxes in the 75189 zip code. It's an 8-page, very nicely put together publication. It's going to be just a one-time mailing at this time due to the money situation. Our information will be placed right here in this column, and there are several good articles. Invitations for the gospel meeting will be in this publication here. Invitations to study the Bible with us, and it's just a very well put together piece of material. And so this is what will be mailed out. Of course, this is a sample copy from the Jacksonville Church of Christ in Jacksonville, Alabama. They are the brethren that we are working with who produce this publication house to house, heart to heart. So be praying for this effort. I'll make this available to anyone who would like to take a look at it. Last week we studied Daniel. As we looked at the book of Daniel, as we looked at a young man who set his heart on doing God's will. And we noticed in Daniel chapter 1 that there were 3 other young men with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 young men, along with Daniel, had an attitude of devotion, dedication, and commitment to God that lasted throughout their life. We saw last week how Daniel was a man of deep conviction, even at a young age, as they were carried into Babylonian captivity, even as teenagers. Their heart was still set on the will of God. Their homeland had been destroyed. The temple had been destroyed. They're in a foreign land, yet they had a commitment to God that transcended their homeland. Sometimes when young people get away from their parents, they can start behaving as though they are not raised in a Christian environment. Sometimes they start doing things that's contrary to the will of God. But yet we see a great example in Daniel, also in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 Hebrew young men who had a commitment to do God's will even though they were far away from home. Even though they went through all kinds of terrible difficulties, yet their mind was set on God. And when that is done at an early age, that will set the person's course for life until they die. When you get to Daniel chapter 3, you can see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's very interesting that in Daniel chapter 3, you have the 3 wise young men. You've heard of the 3 wise men? We're looking at the 3 wise young men of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's very interesting in this context here that Daniel is not mentioned in the chapter. He is not in this event that's going to take place in Daniel chapter 3. There has been speculation as to why. Perhaps he has gone away on an official trip of some sort. We don't know for sure. But we do know that the focus of the attention of the writer of Daniel is on these 3 wise young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Oftentimes in the ancient world, the emperor or the king would try to bring his nation together under one religion. He would try to unify under one religion. He did not care if you worshipped any other god or not. He did not care about that, but he wanted there to be a nationalistic religion that everyone had to pay their allegiance to. And in Daniel chapter 1, or 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, which height was 60 cubits, its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This thing was about 90 feet high, and it was an image of gold. Verse 2, the king Nebuchadnezzar sent forth word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to come to dedicate the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now this could have been one of the many gods that the Babylonians worshipped, or it could be an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself, as oftentimes those ancient monarchs like to be worshipped. And so in verse 3, he gathers together all of these officials together, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, verse 4. Then a herald cried out and said, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time that you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony, with all kinds of music, that you fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning, fiery furnace." The law was very clear. Not hard to understand at all. This image, this idol, had been set up. It was in the plain of Dura. Everyone there, all the officials, were given the word that this is a decree from the king that they are to worship this image when they hear all of these instruments playing. When they hear that music, they are to fall down and worship this God, this image. And if they do not, they'll be killed. They'll be executed. You know, the people of the land could not call the ACLU. They could not protest. They could not say, this is violating our freedom. Because back then they didn't have that. They didn't have that freedom. What the king said goes. And so that was the law. You hear the music, you fall down, you worship the image. Verse 8, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke to King Nebuchadnezzar and said, 'O king, live forever.' And they remind the king of the law that he made, verse 10, 'You made this decree, when you hear these instruments in symphony with all kinds of music, you fall down and you worship the golden image.' And they remind him of the penalty that he made with this law, verse 11, 'that whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace.' He says in verse 12, 'There are certain Jews whom you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon.'" You read that in Daniel chapter 1. How that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were set over some of the work that's done in Babylon. They were serving in the palace. He said there are certain Jews, these young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, "O king, they have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods, nor do they worship the golden image that you have set up." So here you have the situation where the people heard the music, they fall down and worship. No one wants to be executed. No one wants to be burned alive. So they're going to obey the king. And the only ones that did not, in this situation we have here, were these 3 young men. You can just envision this in your mind, that people were standing around this image, and that when the music started, everyone fell down and worshipped except 3 young men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were literally standing up for what they believed. They would not give in to that pressure. They would not bow to the world. They would not bow to the image. When Nebuchadnezzar heard about this, verse 13, in rage and fury, he gave command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these 3 men before the king. The king was angry. He set up this law. To disobey this law was a slap in the face of King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? Is this what I'm hearing is true, that you're not doing what the law says?" He says in verse 15, "Now if you are ready at this time, you hear the sound of all these instruments in symphony and all kinds of music, you can fall down and worship the image which I have made. That is good. But if you don't worship, you will be cast immediately into the midst of the burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Nebuchadnezzar, in essence, is saying, I'm going to give you one more chance. I'm going to give you one more chance to do the politically correct thing. To do what everyone else is doing. Bow to the image. I'll spare your life. If you do not, I will kill you. I will burn you alive. One of the most horrible ways a person can die. And he says, who is that God who will deliver you from my hands? You see the arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar? Later on in the book of Daniel, you'll find that God will humble him. In fact, in chapter 4. Notice the response. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have said among themselves, you know, we're in their country. This is their culture. What good can we do if we're dead? Let's just fit in. In our hearts, you know, we will be loyal to the God of Israel. But just to go along, to get along, let's just bow the knee. God knows our heart. They knew the 10 Commandments still applied to them. Even though they were hundreds of miles away from the Promised Land, even though the temple had been destroyed, their homeland had been ransacked by the Babylonians, they still knew that they were under the obligation of God's law in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 and 2, as it talks about, you don't make a carved image and you do not bow down before that carved image. It still applied to them. They recognized that obligation. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in verse 16 answered and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. In other words, it's already settled. We're not going to negotiate. How many Christians negotiate with their convictions? When it comes to their family, when it comes to their spouse, when it comes to their careers, when it comes to so many things of the world, they negotiate their commitment to God. Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were committed, and they were not going to negotiate the matter. It says in verse 17, if that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. They're saying, and notice they're being very respectful to Nebuchadnezzar. They're not disrespectful to his authority. They're being respectful to him, and they're saying, O king, we know that God can deliver us. That's not a problem with God. All things are possible with God. Verse 18, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. Look at that courage. Look at that conviction. Look at the devotion that they had to God there. You know, they did not have a message from God that said, I'll deliver you. There's no indication here that God spoke to them and said, you'll be delivered. They said, we know God can deliver us because they know the power of God from the Scriptures. And they said, well, even if he does not, verse 18, even if God chooses to allow us to die an agonizing death in the fiery furnace, we're still not going to serve your gods. Come what may, we are loyal to our God. We will not bow to your image. We will not bend our convictions. What a great example for us as Christians. What a tremendous example for the Lord's church today. Look at verse 19. This didn't set well with Nebuchadnezzar. You know, these ancient monarchs, they had a temper. And you could make them mad just like that. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression of his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that the heat of the furnace, to heat the furnace 7 times more than was usually heated. These were these furnaces that were used. Archaeologists have actually found in ancient Babylonian ruins some giant kilns that were used to bake pottery. And oftentimes they would throw prisoners into those giant ovens to execute them. And he says, I want it 7 times hotter than normal. It wasn't really necessary, but Nebuchadnezzar was mad. So he wanted it 7 times hotter than normal. Verse 20, he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Verse 21, then these men were bound with their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar says, I don't want this in my court. I don't want this in my kingdom. Get these troublemakers out of here. Kill them. So they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Verse 22, therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The fire was so hot outside the furnace that it killed the men that actually threw those 3 wise young men into it. Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was thinking in his mind, I got these troublemakers out of my kingdom. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He arose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. Verse 25. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Literally in the Hebrew, it is the Son of the Divine One, or the Divine Ones, plural. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar would not know anything about Jesus Christ because this is 500 years before he's born. The expression there, Son of God, is referring to this is a divine being. This is a heavenly being that's in there in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, it could have been Christ, no doubt about it. But we cannot conclude that from the remarks of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he's a pagan king. And he's going to speak forth things that are of a pagan origin. They did not burn. They did not burn. They would not bow. They did not bend their convictions. And they did not burn in the fire. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, spoke saying, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants, notice his attitude change, of the Most High God, come out and come here. Remember what he said earlier? Who is that God that's going to deliver you from my hand? Now he is saying servants of the Most High God. Notice the impression that these 3 young men made upon this pagan king. You know, when we stand for what is right, when we will refuse to bend our convictions and we are steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 15:58, that's going to make an impression on people. And that's exactly what we find here. Nebuchadnezzar is not only impressed with the miracle that took place, but impressed with their devotion. Servants of the Most High God, come out of here. Verse 26, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth from the midst of the fire. And all of the officials, verse 27, the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these 3 men, on whose bodies the fire had no power. It didn't even touch them. The hair of their head was not singed, nor their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not even on them. So completely God delivered them. They didn't even smell like fire. Verse 28. You see, verses 28 through 30, a great statement of faith from Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar spoke saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. This is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the God of David, Solomon, and Saul. This is the God who created the heavens and the earth." And Nebuchadnezzar is recognizing him and praising him. Blessed be that God of these three wise young men, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's words and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Verse 29, "Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Remember what he said earlier? Who is that God that can deliver you from my hands? Now he's acknowledging the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse 30, "Then the king promoted these three wise young men in the province of Babylon." This would not have happened if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if they were politically correct and they went along with everyone else. If they would have bowed the knee, or if they had bent their convictions, this wouldn't have happened. Yet they had a strong conviction that they were the servants of God no matter what was happening. And they are not going to change their convictions because of their surroundings. What a lesson for us today. What a lesson for young people and for those who are older. You know, Paul tells Titus in Titus chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, "Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded." Young men, young women, think clearly. "Be sober-minded," verse 7, "in all things showing yourself a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility," verse 8, "sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you." You know what Paul is telling Titus as a young man? He's saying, you as a preacher, you exhort the young people that they live in such a way. They live with the attitude of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who would not bow, who did not bend, and could not burn. You live in such a way that when people have something to say against you, they can't come up with anything. That the only thing they really have against you is you're a faithful Christian. That's all they can say against you. And if that's the worst a person can say about our young people, that you're a faithful Christian, that's a compliment. They did not bow, they did not bend, and they did not burn. And if we have that same type of conviction as those three wise young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we will not bow to this world. No matter what kind of peer pressure is around us, we will not bend when the heat is on, and we will not burn in the persecution that surrounds us. There is a fiery trial of persecution that we face. James chapter 1 talks about that. If we endure, we'll come out as pure gold. You can begin that journey this very morning. If you have faith in Jesus Christ and you're willing to confess that faith, repent of all of your sins, and you're willing to be immersed in water, baptized into Christ, born of water and the Spirit, the Lord will add you to His church, the kingdom. If you've done that, you've gone astray, we urge you to repent. Come back to the Lord. As always, the choice is yours, while we stand and while we sing.